All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. We're going to get on into our next segment of the show, but before we do that, just want to just remind you guys once again that if you have any questions or any comments, or if you want to contribute to the show in any way, you can just hit up the super chat button on gsmcsports.net and type down your question or your comment, and I will get to it as soon as I see it. So definitely do that if you get a chance to. So let's go ahead and get into the next portion of our show. And like I said, this is a pretty historical themed show tonight. And I was very interested in doing these segments because I love looking back at old NFL highlights and old NFL films, highlights especially, and just looking back on all the greatest teams in the NFL over the years. And there's been some great ones. You know, we, of course, have experienced a relatively recent one with the Chiefs, you know, of course, chasing their three-peat and all of that. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first team I'm going to put on here, and you might just think I'm just being a homer here just by putting them as the first team I covered. But this, again, I'm not necessarily putting this in any particular order. These are just, you know, 5 of the greatest that I believe are. So let's go ahead with the first team that I have is the Steelers of the 1970s, coached by head coach and Hall of Famer Chuck Noll. 4 Super Bowl titles, of course, with guys like Terry Bradshaw, you know, on offense, John Stallworth, Lynn Swann, you know, all of those guys, Rocky Bleier, Franco Harris, you know, all those guys on offense, they're all Hall of Famers. And defensively, of course, they had the steel curtain defense, and that was the mammoth, you know, front 7 that the Steelers had with Joe Green, Ernie Holmes, Elsie Greenwood, Dwight White on the front line. And then, of course, at linebackers, you had Jack Ham and Jack Lambert, 2 Hall of Famers as well. And then don't forget about Mel Blount on the back end there. Legendary defense. And during the 70s, they were fantastic. They were the first team in NFL history to win win back-to-back Super Bowls twice. They were also the first team to reach 4 Super Bowls as well, and they were also the first team to win 4 Super Bowls in 6 years as well. So overall, during that 70s stint, the Steelers had a 99-44 record with 1 tie in the regular season, and of course, Super Bowl championship 4 times, and they were an outstanding team, legendary defense, you know, one of the more physical teams in NFL history. Chuck Noll was a no-nonsense kind of head coach, but he was a fantastic head coach, and it's a shame that I never really got a chance to watch him be the coach and watch those 70s teams, because that's a little bit before my time. But that's the one thing as a Steeler fan that, you know, I regret, even though there's nothing you can do to change something like that. But, you know, being born like in that 70s era would have been awesome, you know, to watch those Steeler teams as a big Steeler fan that I am, to watch them win 4 Super Bowls and just dominate the NFL during that time frame. It's, you know, it would have been really, really fun to see that. But just looking at all the old highlights is still, you know, a treat as well. It's a Hall of Fame, you know, team. Almost every single person on that team were Hall of Famers, you know. Despite what a lot of people in Pittsburgh may think of Terry Bradshaw, he was also a Hall of Famer, you know. And that offense was fantastic as well, but the defense was really what made everything tick. So they were definitely one of the greatest of all time. You could probably make the argument that they could be the greatest dynasty of all time, if not for what the Patriots were able to do in the 2000s, winning those 6 Super Bowls. Outside of them, I think that, you know, they would probably be the one team that I would say franchise-wise probably be the best dynasty. Just those 6 Super Bowls is, you know, a ridiculous feat, no matter how you might think of the Patriots overall. But we'll get to them in a second, because obviously they're on this list too. But the next team that I have on here is the Cowboys of the 90s. They won 3 Super Bowls, 2 under Jimmy Johnson, 1 under Barry Switzer. Hall of Fame players like Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, and Emmitt Smith. Emmitt Smith had the all-time record for career rushing yards for a while there, for like years and years and years he did. He was listed as you could make the argument that he's one of the greatest running backs of all time. Walter Payton is up there, obviously, too. Barry Sanders is up there. You're talking about like the greatest running backs of all time and everything like that. So a lot of great running backs, Gale Sayers, Eric Dickerson, all of those guys. But Emmitt Smith, he was right up there, and he stood alone for a while with that record. Jimmy Johnson, their head coach, like I said, he was the first coach to win a national championship and a Super Bowl. He won a national championship with the Miami Hurricanes, and then, of course, won 2 Super Bowls as the Cowboys coach before Jerry Jones sort of forced Johnson out because they had sort of a disagreement right before that season that they won in '95 when they won the Super Bowl with Barry Switzer. But Barry Switzer, like I said, he did end up being the coach that year, inherited an incredible team, and they won their 3rd Super Bowl of the '90s that year. And obviously, they would have probably won the Super Bowl if Jimmy Johnson was the coach of that team regardless. So, and they may have won more Super Bowls under Jimmy Johnson if they didn't have that falling out between Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson. Maybe they have more. Maybe they have the most Super Bowls of all time. Who knows? Because they have 5 now, and they've been stuck on 5 ever since that final Super Bowl win against the Steelers in 1995 when Larry Brown had those 2 interceptions returned for touchdowns on Neil O'Donnell. I remember very vividly that game. That was actually probably my first Steelers memory that I really truly remember was watching that game with my dad. I remember just sitting at the edge of the bed in their room, in my mom and dad's room, watching that game in 1995 and watching Neil O'Donnell basically make my dad have an aneurysm. And obviously it hurt watching it, but I didn't know the gravity of the loss, until, of course, I got older because I was just a kid back then. But that's just a fond little memory, but still sucks that they lost that game. But looking back on it now, I would love a Super Bowl appearance. Even if they lost, I would love to get there. It would suck to lose, but I would love to get there again, because that would mean that the team is moving in the right direction. So, and they're not. So, but I digress. The next team that I have on this list, like I mentioned briefly before, I have the Patriots of the 2000s era, and that is 6 Super Bowl titles that they won. That's more than any other dynasty in the NFL of all the teams. It's the same amount of titles as the Steelers have in terms of Super Bowl titles, but in terms of dynasty Super Bowls by one coach on one team, that's the most. So Tom Brady is widely considered the greatest quarterback of all time. He led the way for the Patriots for those 20 years or so that they were, dominating the league and winning Super Bowls. But he's got a Hall of Fame resume, or you could at least make the argument that he has a Hall of Fame resume in 3 different decades. He won a Super Bowl in the 2020s. He won a Super Bowl in the 2010s, or he won many Super Bowls in the 2010s. He won many Super Bowls in the early 2000s. If you take a look at all of his stats over those 3 decades, and even though I know the 2020s, he wasn't in the league that long in the 2020s, but still got a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay, during that time. So you could make the argument that he has that Hall of Fame resume in 3 different decades, which no other player could make that argument, because Brady has 7 Super Bowl rings, 1 with the Buccaneers, of course, and then 6 with the New England Patriots. And head coach Bill Belichick, also considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest coach of all time. So you definitely got to put him up there as one of the greatest. And during Tom Brady's 20 seasons with New England, along with Bill Belichick, but when those two were, partners and Brady was starting during those 20 seasons, their record was 249-75 in the regular season and playoffs. They had 6 Super Bowl wins, of course, 9 AFC championship appearances, and an unreal 17 AFC East titles. They won the AFC East in all but 3 seasons that Tom Brady was the starting quarterback of that team. So ridiculous longevity of that success too. So they were very good and arguably the greatest dynasty of all time. The other teams that I just have a couple more teams on this list here. The other team I have is the 49ers of the 80s and early 90s. Head coach Bill Walsh. He was the pioneer, the architect of the West Coast offense that you see in some teams across the league nowadays. His impact on the NFL just goes beyond how he built the 49ers dynasty. For as impactful as he was offensively with his offensive philosophy, his list of accomplishments really is incredible. If you take a look at the things that he did, he drafted Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, Charles Haley, Jerry Rice, then identified Steve Young's talent and traded for him. And then, of course, Steve Young ended up winning the Super Bowl. But, he was one of the greatest head coaches of all time leading that team. And like I said, those Hall of Fame players that he was able to get through the draft and through trades, that's all Bill Walsh and that front office, of course, being able to do that. But he was a brilliant mind on and off the field in the front office. But he definitely was a big reason why they dominated the 80s and a short portion of the 90s. They won 3 Super Bowls under Bill Walsh before he retired, before the 1988 title that they won. George Seifert took over as the head coach, and he won the Super Bowl with Steve Young in 1989 as well as 1994. And during that 14-year stretch, the 49ers won a total of 5 Super Bowls, lost in the NFC Championship game 4 times, and posted a 159-56-1 record overall. So obviously a great team, great dynasty, definitely has to be put up there as one of the greatest. 5 Super Bowls total when you combine that whole decade. 2 different coaches, Bill Walsh, of course, leading the way for 3 of them, and then George Seifert winning a Super Bowl in 89 and 94 as well, before Steve Mariucci eventually took over as the head coach there. And they were still competitive going forward. Never won a Super Bowl under Mariucci, though, but, they were always up there, always in the playoffs and, championship games and all that. But the other team that I have on here, and it kind of goes without saying here, this team belongs on this list just because of the influence that their head coach ended up having on the game, one of the founding fathers of the NFL, and that is Vince Lombardi's Packers of the 1960s. And the Packers were a struggling team in 1959 when Vince Lombardi took over and transformed them into the dominant force that they ended up being. They won 5 league championships in 7 years. And keep in mind, this is before the AFL-NFL merger that was in 73, I believe, or 72. And they won championships in 1961, 1962, 1965, 66, and 67. So 2 years in a row they won NFL championships, and then a couple years off, and then 3 years in a row from 65 to 67 they won NFL championships. Won the first 2 Super Bowls as well in 1967. So the merger was in 67. So I apologize for that, but they won in 1967. That was Super Bowl I, and then 1968 Super Bowl II. And they were not officially called Super Bowls until Super Bowl III in 1969, but still counts as Super Bowl wins, though. So those dynasty years from 65 to 67, though, they just cemented their status as a dynasty, with those championships, those 3 consecutive championships running from 65 to 67. And, of course, Vince Lombardi's legacy and, just how great he was as a head coach. And that's why the trophy is named after him, because he's won the first 2 Super Bowls ever and is just a pioneer in this whole, league that we enjoy now. So one other team I'm going to put on there real quick, just before we end this segment, is a present and modern day team, and that is the Kansas City Chiefs. They've been to 5 Super Bowls since 2019, won 3 of them. And, of course, they had a chance for a 3-peat this year, but lost to Philadelphia. But they have an 89-23 record under Patrick Mahomes and head coach Andy Reid. And Mahomes has been to the AFC Championship game in 7 years as the starter. 7 straight years. Every year that he's been the starter, they've been in the AFC Championship game. That's how good and how consistent they are. And Andy Reid also is the first NFL coach in history to lead 2 different franchises in all-time wins. So obviously he's got to be up there as one of the greatest coaches of all time. They came the closest to anybody that, had a chance to 3-peat in NFL history. Every other team had either lost the first round of the playoffs or didn't make it at all. So the Chiefs got all the way to the Super Bowl before they lost, their 3-peat bid. So they've lost to just 3 different quarterbacks in the entire postseason as well. So Mahomes has lost to Brady twice, once in the playoffs, once in the Super Bowl. Lost to Burrow in the AFC Championship game a few years ago, and then, of course, last year losing to Jalen Hurts. So the Chiefs definitely belong on this list as one of the greatest dynasties of all time, and it's still currently going, so they may add to this, before their time is up. So we'll have to see. But those are my teams, my dynasties. If you have difference of opinion or one that you want to add on there that I might have forgotten, then definitely let me know in the comments, and we can get going with a little conversation as well. So that's the segment for my dynasties. When we come back, we're going to keep going with this whole history theme, and now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the guys that we talked about in this last segment, but top 5 head coaches in the NFL of all time. So we'll take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about that. So stick with us. We'll be right back.